Okay, well thank you very much for inviting me. And it's been, yes, an interesting journey, I would say. Okay, so this evening I've been asked to talk a bit and do a bit around learning journals. And that's what I will do. Or at least I will do some of it, and I'm hoping you will do some of it too. I want this to be really informal. We have, what, an hour and a half, is that right?
Yeah.
Yes. And so I really would like to do, as much as we need to through your questions and through discussion. My general aim, I guess, is to sort of just lay out a bit about learning journals to start with. And then I've got in my head, I've got 3 sort of structured exercises that would help you to explore an issue, but not just by sitting down and reflecting on it directly. They're kind of getting around the back of the brain a bit, I suppose. I feel like trying to find a different way into thinking about some issues. But I've no idea how much time, I know that we'd be very short of time for 3, but I'll see how we get on with that. There's one in particular I'd like to suggest to you. Okay, how many of you use learning journals? Let's say how many of you use learning journals with students? Right, so some of you do. In what contexts? Tell me. Which sort of students?
Social work students.
Right.
A multidisciplinary degree called Human Sciences.
Right.
And they've got to bring it together somehow.
Oh, great, yes.
So,
Sort of
various modules through the programme. Keep a learning diary of your experiences through the year and write a reflective essay using your learning diary.
Okay, well that's, as you'll see, that's the bit I like, that last bit. Okay, anyone else using learning journals with students?
Undergraduate sociology students, especially in critical reading and writing.
Right, okay, so that's a different sort of angle. Okay, thank you very much. And how many of you use learning journals yourselves? Yes. Okay, and what sort of contexts, again? Rebecca?
Really, I've been doing ethnography as part of my PhD, so very much the sort of bread and butter of reflecting.
Yes, so it's really important.
Yeah.
Who else was?
I have to do it as part of my maths BBC.
Right.
We have to do like an electronic upload once a week, just a short one that our tutors read, so it also acts as a kind of communication between them. And then there's 6 kind of more official ones over the year, so you draw on your informal ones to do the written assignments that you have got.
Yes, I mean what I'm going to be doing is talking to some of you as journal writers yourselves. I guess all of you as journal writers yourselves, but some of you who work with students and some of you who are students. So there'll be bits that aren't appropriate to all of you. But as I say, please, let's run this by things that you want to talk about, and please do stop me in my in my flow and say, I've got a question or an issue. Okay, and one of the things I'll say right at the beginning is that when I talk about journals, I will probably talk as if we're talking about pen and ink, pen and paper, okay? But I know that a lot of people write journals on screens nowadays, so electronically. But there are all sorts of other media as well. I mean, artists and architects keep what they might call a notebook, which is actually often a kind of journal of little sketches that they want to remember, things they want to think about, little notes, and they would call that a notebook. There are all sorts of names for journals. Journals, logs, diaries, think book, any other names that you've come across?
Commonplace book.
Commonplace book, which is an old name for it. Yeah, lovely name, isn't it? I like unusual names. I really actually like the possibility of asking students to think what they want to call their journals. Find your own name for it. As much as I like getting them to find their own format, which of course is a bit limited when you're doing it on a screen. Okay, yes, I think there are 1 or 2 more names, but I can't remember them immediately. Let me just pick up my notes, and I did write them down earlier on. Think book is another one. Day book is another one, yes. So there are lots of different ideas around that. Okay, journals, I think, I will tend to call them journals. I think of them as being a good journal, I think as being structured and unstructured. And I suppose those, I'm not sure that I really like the word structured, but basically some of them, some writing I like to think of as just, you know, sitting down and reflecting on something or on a regular basis. But some bits I like to be exercises that perhaps trick our minds into thinking about things slightly differently. And as I say, I'm going to give you a few exercises a bit later on, I hope. If I don't, you have access to 2 handouts, is it? Yes, I sent 2 handouts. One of which is written for anyone who keeps a journal, and it's got lots of more information in than I will talk about here, although it'll cover quite a lot of what I'm saying here too. The other one is consists more of structured exercises that you could use to explore your professional thinking or to explore professional situations, or actually to, I used to run workshops on research thinking. There are lots of exercises in those which kind of help you get around some problems in research, so you can use the same sort of exercises for those as well. Okay, so if I talk a bit about formats of journals, I mean, again, as I know, some of them are, stuck on screens, but I always like the idea of loose leaf journals. The reason is that then you can add things or you can take them out. And one of the realities is that in academic situations, often journals are written by people who know somebody else is going to see them. And the trouble is, because somebody else is going to see what I write, I'm going to be quite careful what I really... I don't think you should have students here. I'm going to be quite careful about what I write, so that my tutor, doesn't see the things I really would be I really happened. So I think the idea of a loose leaf journal allows people to be freer, but they can then do their own editing later on. Whereas if you've got a fixed book which has page after page after page, that's much more difficult. And I like sticking things in journals sometimes, and I might actually have something else stick in a few pages back, and loose leaf again gives me that flexibility. Actually, the flexibility is one of the things that often online journals actually really don't have, because they're set up so that what is written a few days ago, or even sort of so many hours ago, suddenly gets set into concrete and you can't modify it. And I think that's a fairly inflexible form of journal. I mean, it's not what I think I feel very comfortable with, but that's the way they've been set up. Very often by people who don't write journals, I found that once, there was about maybe 7 or 8 years ago, technologists became incredibly excited about journals online. And they were setting them up in the way they thought they ought to be set up. And I thought, have you actually talked to anyone who's used a journal? And actually they hadn't. So that's the way they got set up. Actually, I'm just thinking, I mentioned the 2 handouts that you can get access to. On the top of the handouts, there are references to lots of materials, some of which I've written, that would help you further with journals. Obviously, I'm going to be quite limited in what I say in this period of time, especially when I want to get so much into this time. One of the handouts has in it, am I right? Well, anyway, I will make sure you have access to a handout that has an exercise in it that helps people to get started with reflective writing. Karen, I know you said you'd use the park exercise, yes. So some of you will have done this kind of exercise. I think one of the problems with setting up learning journals for students' use is that actually a lot of people don't really know what reflective writing looks like. You're telling me to do this writing, well, show me what you mean by it. And the reality is that why should teaching staff have any better idea what reflection looks like? Maybe teaching staff who are coming in now will have written journals in their student days, but certainly in my day nobody ever talked about writing learning journals. So, you know, it's an issue for all of us, I suppose. When I was writing about reflective learning, I wondered how I would get people to write reflectively. So I designed an exercise that seems to work quite well, and I use the same format. I've written a number of exercises in similar format. It's an exercise, well, the first one is called The Park, and basically it's a short story, if you like, written at 4 levels of reflection. And the way I like to run it is that I show people the first account of it. They sit in small groups round tables. They read the first account of it, and then I get them to discuss how reflective it is. Now, the first account is very descriptive. It's very much just a sort of short story, if you like. Then I get them to read the second account, and that's slightly more reflective. And they discuss how reflective it is, and then the third account, and they discuss it, and then the fourth account, and they discuss it. And then I get them to think about what has changed between the first account, the very descriptive one, and the fourth one. So actually what they're looking at is the issue of depth in reflection. Because I found the notion of depth to be really useful. I actually think it coincides with what a lot of people will now call critical reflection. But since I wrote a book called on critical thinking and one on reflection, I'd really like to keep the two things rather apart. And although I do acknowledge there are big overlaps between critical thinking and reflection, I think critical reflection is a slightly uneasy name for me, because I think there are a lot more things in deep reflection than simply more critique. There's a lot more that makes deep reflection deep, other than just critical thinking. However, what people call things doesn't really matter so much as what they do with them, and I think the recognition of superficial descriptive writing isn't really going to help people to learn all that much in comparison with much deeper writing, much deeper reflection, I think is important. So those exercises called graduated scenarios, they are available, and I'm not absolutely sure, Karen, whether they're in, sorry, Rebecca, whether they're in the handouts I sent you. I think they are, but I can make sure.
I think on the website you've got 3
Right.
things that you
Okay,
can
that's
send,
fine.
So,
Okay, well, there are a number of different exercises like that. Another one that I tend to use more with postgraduate level or professional development level is one called the GP story. It's about a GP who makes judgments about a patient who comes in with aches and pains, and it turns out they are real, and and it's his reflection on why he made the judgments he made, and how he comes to think at a greater depth about it. The notion of depth, by the way, it's not mentioned in any of these exercises, but it's based very much on sort of my reading and so on. And if you want to read about that, that's in the books. These exercises are based on a framework, which are called a framework for reflective writing. And so there's a model that underpins them as well, which comes with the exercises. And I would say that those kind of exercises, or some other kind of exercise that helps people to understand what reflective writing looks like, is a rather important start to getting people to keep a journal. In my experience, I think everyone can reflect. I think reflection is part of what we do as humans. I think the difference very often is between those who are conscious that they're reflecting. That's one difference. And those who are not. But secondly, between those who are reflecting in their heads and those who actually end up representing their reflection in writing or drawing or whatever. Because actually that's a further process. If you think about it, if I could look reflective in looking at this, but you wouldn't know whether I was reflecting or not because it's going on in my head. So it's only when I actually represent it in writing, or I talk about it, or draw a picture, or do a dance even, represent that reflection, that you have any idea of whether I'm reflecting or not. But I actually think we learn more when we reflect, when we represent our reflection. When I write something down, I'm translating what I would say is kind of multi-dimensional thoughts onto a linear sequence on paper. So I think I'm learning more as I represent that reflection. But, and I think this is relevant to learning journals, I think I learn differently from different forms of representation. So I think I learn something from writing, but if I draw a picture of which represents my kind of emotional turmoil or happiness or whatever at an event, I will learn something different from that picture. And I think we might learn more about the emotional side of things from drawing than from writing. And I think that in keeping learning journals, it's actually a good idea to represent your reflection in different ways. Okay, let me throw this over to you a little bit. Any sort of immediate comments or anything that anyone wants to say? One of the things when there's me talking into my space, isn't it? Anything yet?
The map journal is one of the internet journals, but it's very good. You can do anything with it, go back on dates and
right. So there are journals online that are becoming more, what did you call it? A map
journal.
Map journal.
MAC.
Oh, map journal, sorry. Didn't hear what you said. Right, so, okay, so there are journal formats online that are becoming more flexible. Yes, okay, thank you. Okay. In terms of format, yes, that's what it is. When I started off with I did a journal writing course called the Intensive Journal Workshop, and a lot of the exercises I've learnt in terms of journal writing came from that. The intensive journal it became a sort of idea about journals developed by Ira Progoff, who was a Jungian analyst in the States, or is, I'm not quite sure whether he is or was. But he found that he was asking his clients who came for therapy to write about in various ways between their visits. And he developed those forms of writing into particular sort of formats of exploration of one's life. One's spiritual life, one's sort of day-to-day life, but also kind of periods of time. One of the things he talks about is period logs. The idea that over a particular period of my life, I have a kind of particular sense or a theme or a feeling about it. And then things change and I move on into a different phase of my life. So he's talking about exploring that sort of idea. There's the exercises I will do with you, some of those come from his work. But at that time I was asked to be writing in A4. Well, actually I found that far too cumbersome to carry around with me. And so I moved down to A5, half of A4, and found that too big for a handbag when I was writing my own journal. So I found a way of folding A5 in half, and with a folder that sort of folds down on it. And although it means you're writing in A5, because it's folded over, you're actually only carrying I suppose it's A6, a really small journal. And I think issues about how big a journal is are really personal and relate to how people feel about what size they want to write on or work on. And I like people having that choice. I don't know, how many of you are writing on electronic screens and how many are writing on paper? Anyone writing on paper? Yes. Okay. Oh, good. Well, I'm sort of... Should I be saying that? And how many are writing electronically? Oh, right. So actually fewer of you writing electronically, some of you writing on both. Yeah, it's interesting. So, I mean, electronic means are obviously getting more tidy and more comfortable to write with. Okay. When I started researching learning journals for the book I wrote, I found about 20 different purposes for writing learning journals. Some were kind of for therapy, some were to learn more about professional, education. Some were, now there's some particularly interesting ones that really caught my imagination, and the maths students here might be interested in maths teachers might be interested in this. I think the example came from either physics or engineering, but it doesn't actually matter because actually it's talking about mathematical writing. There was a tutor who, I think an American tutor, who was concerned that his students, as I say physics or engineering, weren't doing much actual writing. So he decided to set up using a learning journal so that they actually had to write a bit. And he asked them to write, instead of just doing mathematical problems in engineering or physics, he asked them to describe what they were doing, so to reflect as they did it. So if, for example, they came to a place where they had a bit of a dilemma about what procedure to use, he said, right, we'll write it down. Just write down that you had a dilemma. Just describe, reflect on the process of doing solving your problems. But the very interesting outcome of that work was not that the students actually got better at writing, sadly, but that they actually got better at solving problems. And I've often thought that was a really interesting example of an unexpected finding around journal writing. Yes, so I think there are masses of different purposes for which people set up journals, and I think it's really, really important that if you set up journals with students, you say why you are doing it. Not just you're introducing a journal, but you say why you're doing it. Because actually any kind of assessment needs to relate to the purpose for the journal being set up. It is possible, I think, very often that people set up a journal thinking, well, this is a good idea, and they don't necessarily, they may have something in mind as a purpose, and maybe they state it, but actually the journal turns out to serve a different purpose than the one originally thought of. So when you set up a journal, you may find out that it's actually serving purposes different from those you expected, which may then become the new purpose. But I think it's really important to tell students why they're keeping a journal and what you hope they will get out of it. Otherwise you don't really have an assessment regime on which basis to mark that sort of material. Okay. I've just got a note of the sort of journals I keep here. I end up keeping a number of journals. I keep a day-to-day journal, and I have done for a very long time. I mean, at times I've gone through kind of with the intensive journal stuff, but that took too long to keep going with. So I do keep a day-to-day journal, which I write up most nights, and it just feels like a comfortable thing to go to bed with. Or sometimes in the day, or if I've got a major problem, I write it in it. It's a friend there somehow. But if I have a big project of any sort, I will often set up a journal. I will set up a journal for it. At the moment, I'm doing some work for the Football Association on helping football coaches to become more reflective, interestingly. And I've just set up a journal to work with that. And actually, my journal is a place for notes. It's a place for things I need to look at, people I need to see, so quite definitely objective sort of things, as well as my senses and my feelings about the project as well. Ideas, it's a place I can put ideas down in. I've recently summarised a lot of the reading I've done. That's gone into the journal. So actually my journal has dividers in it. So it's not only loose leaf, but it has dividers because there are different kind of informations going into it. And it's all in one place. And it's very loose leaf. In fact, I've got it with me. I mean, I've only fairly recently started doing this, so. must have stuck it in the other section of my bag. I'll get it out later. But this is another journal I keep. This is my travel journal. And it's that size, and it's loose leaf, and I just add some pages to it when I go away, and I do a few sketches in it, and it's small and neat, and it just sort of goes wherever I go, if I go abroad or if I travel anywhere. So that's my travel log, and I mean that is just, it's a bit different from the day-to-day material. So I do keep quite a few journals, but they're different. Okay. Oh, sorry. This is my FA log. Loose leaf, treasury tags, great things. And I add pages, and it's got dividers in it, and different bits of it serve different purposes. There is a section of pure reflective writing. I don't write in there all the time. I write in there just sometimes. And I do go back over it. I think that's a really important, now I suppose this is really where I start moving into talking about assessment. I'm not going to talk too much longer because I do want to get down to doing something. Yeah, I do look back over what I've written. I think that when we ask students to write journals and we just leave them at the raw reflective writing stage, and we might mark them as they are, something happens or they have to write on a regular basis, and we just collect them and look at that. I think we're losing out on a lot of potential learning. I think that what we really need to be doing is getting everybody, anyone who's writing a journal, to look back through that raw reflection and engage in what I would call secondary reflection. So that's where I think we do the learning. It's when we look back over what we've reflected on already and re-reflect, if you like. There is a sort of journal called a double entry journal. I can show you this. It's like if you have a journal like that, you might get people to write on one side and you leave the other side blank for further reflection at a later stage. Or you might get them to rule a line down the middle and just write on one half of the page. That's called a double entry journal, which again ensures that this reflective secondary reflection occurs. Now, let's just move on to assessment of journals, because that's always been quite a difficult one. And when I wrote the first book on learning journals, I really knew I hadn't kind of got to where I wanted to get to with that. I think that when we assess, it is much better to assess something like an account of what I have learnt in my journal. So we get students to write the journal, and then we get them to write an account, I wouldn't call it an essay, an account of something like what I have learnt as a result of keeping a journal. But it might have a different title. And we might say, using quotations from my journal, so it means they actually have to go back through the journal and take chunks out, which may also mean it needs to be page numbered. Now, the reason I think this is a good way of assessing is that actually more for a learning purpose than for the actual assessment side, because it does force people to go back through their original reflective writing. Increasingly, this is how I think people are assessing journals. Now, the problem is that you may well get some students who will actually never keep the journal. They'll just simply write what appears to be the sort of summative account. So how can you deal with that? Well, you can say, I need to see your journals. So that means some of them will write a journal, construct a journal at the last, the weekend before they have to hand the other thing in. And you may get in journals that are that thick. What you can do is do something like manipulate the situation with a few marks. Now, if I just talk about numbers, but you can translate this into your own system. You could say, I will give up to 5 extra marks for really excellent journals. So you need to set up a few criteria. So journals where there's a lot of effort being put in, they've been kept really nicely, there's a lot of kind of quite deep thinking in them. I will give up to 5 marks extra, but actually what I'll mark is the account. For really poor journals, I'll take up to 5 marks off. So that means you can steer the quality of the actual journal writing, as well as making sure they do the secondary reflection. Another way to deal with journal writing, I mean another problem you might have if you were just marking the journals themselves, is that some journals will come in that thick, and you don't want to spend your life reading all that, but some will come in that thick, and how do you compare them? So one of the suggestions around that, if you are looking at the actual journals only, is that you say, I will mark 2,000, 2,500, 3,000 words. You, to the student, select which words you want me to mark. So actually that does, on the basis of some criteria, that does force students to think about what is it that meets the criteria that have been set. Okay. I think I've sort of said as much as I want to actually say around journals. Okay. So really this is our open to questions now for a bit, and then I'll move into the other bit. I think I asked for some big paper. Have you got some? Did you have some A5 paper?
Rather than get that, sorry.
A3. A3, sorry. I think we might find it
I won't
useful.
take me a second. Sorry.
There's some pens, no, people have pens. Okay, any sort of questions? Or comments? Please throw in your own ideas.
You came in late. You didn't see me when I said that I did use German.
Oh, right. Yes.
Teaching. What you've discussed is very similar to what I use on the course, which is in the research training degree.
Oh, right, yes.
The one thing that I'd like to add to that is about the people who just do their commentary at the last moment.
Yes.
Is that I have built in week by week a small section for people to talk about their journals.
Yes.
So that people tend to bring them along, and you can see, week 2, the ones who started and the ones who haven't, and by week 3 they all start.
Yes.
And they bring along the start.
And what that helps with, because it's a great idea, is that actually often students find it really difficult and to get started, and actually don't get much out of it to start with. But actually, as they build up a bit of writing and get more used to it, they often look back on it and will say, this is one of the best things I did on the course. But to start with, it's feeling like really hard work, and you have to say to them, I think you might find this really horrible to start with, but you'll get more out of it later. And very often it allows people also to see how they have changed, how they've progressed in their own learning, which is a good thing to do.
Can you say a little bit about structure? Because whenever I tell my social work students to have a reflective journal, some of them just get it straight away and they don't need any kind of further instruction, but some are really quite stuck with that whole notion of writing things down and saying, can you give me a structure? And I'm always a bit kind of ambivalent about whether you give people structure or not. And I just wondered what your views on that.
Well, I know there are a lot of sort of reflective structures which are meant to help people reflecting on models. I mean, there are sets of questions which supposedly take people into deep reflection. And I thought about this. I think they can be helpful, but I think also there's a danger if you have structures that actually students just peg themselves to the structure. And actually what you do by asking questions is allow students simply to respond to the question, when actually part of what you're asking them, you need them to do, is to understand how to ask the question. They need to be the creators of their own questioning. I mean, I don't know whether you've used the exercises, the GP story in the park, those sorts of things. Because the design of those is meant to get them started a bit with reflective writing. And sometimes I do more exercises based on those. For example, I might ask them to write, after doing those kind of exercises, I get people to write a bit of their own reflection. And then to hand it on to somebody else, and I get the other person to look at it, so I mean they know it's going to be handed on anyway. And I don't mind if it's fictional either at this stage. The other person looks at it and formulates 5 sort of reactions or questions that would help that first person to deepen the material. And then it goes back to the first person who can respond or not to those questions. So sometimes using a sort of pairing of people helps to stir up some of the deeper questioning. But I think the reality is that some people take to reflective writing like ducks to water, and some people struggle with it. I used to notice that there was almost amazingly consistency, and actually it's true of this group too, which I commented to Karen on, about 20 to 25% of men, given a free situation where males or females can come to a workshop around learning journals or reflective writing, it's so amazingly consistent, this 20 to 25% of men, and the rest are women. I think women do find reflective writing a little bit more easy. Now, I always at this stage ask men who are present what they feel about that. I mean, you know, I don't know where it comes from, but somebody said to me, I used to deny that and pretend it was, oh, no, it doesn't really exist. But actually, somebody said to me that little girls keep diaries, and most little boys don't. At which point I always expect all the men to put their hands up. But I don't know how you feel about it.
Yeah. I mean, I remember it being a very highly, like the girls' diaries always had little locks on and they were glittery and all of that. And it was a very, I keep a diary, I have these private,
Wow.
It was I suppose, a very girlish. Yeah. But my question is related, and it's about whether they're kind of certain aptitudes towards certain kind of performances of reflection. Because I've always felt very uncomfortable being a reflective diary person. And I've had to do it in a number of different situations, and I hate it.
Right.
Because I just think, well, first of all, it's something for me that happens in my head.
Yes.
And anything I do is a really conscious performance of it. So, so for in a PGCE, for instance, I just found a formula, and I felt like I wasn't really getting anything out of it. That was to tick a box for paperwork. Yeah. And it was really uncomfortable. And actually, the genuine reflections would happen in my head, but maybe it was partly I felt uncomfortable sharing. But I don't know. It was something about that I was expected to feel okay with it, and it was totally. There was no discussion of how problematic some people might find that, or why it was more comfortable for different people and others, and gender might be a part of that.
I suppose I just don't, I don't know that I've got an answer to that one. I think that some things we have different things we like doing. And perhaps for some people who get used to using journals, they actually have ways of using it, using them that make sense for them. And other people just don't do that. I often think about scientists, journals and scientists. Hardly ever do I get science, I may be wrong, there might be here people involved, well, you're in education and science, but I hardly ever get scientists coming to workshops. And I think, well, actually, the disciplines of sciences, as they are, as they appear in higher education at least, what actually goes on is much more kind of objective, and what actually gets written down in scientific papers is much more objective, and it's not reflective, whereas in humanities and the arts, actually a certain amount of reflective writing fits very well, and the humanities, yes, reflective writing is kind of the way we do it almost. So I actually think there are disciplinary differences as well, but I don't think it means that scientists don't reflect. I think they're reflecting on the way to work, everywhere, but they don't write it down.
Except in their lab notebooks.
Right, okay, yes, so there, that's, this, yes, you.
Yeah, I wanted to say two things. One actually first in response to the comment you just spoke there about reflecting.
Having difficulty with writing.
So I think it's one thing to reflect in your head. It's actually another thing to try and write it down, and it's only by writing it down. The process of writing it down forces us to reflect on the reflection. I mean, in articulating it.
That's right. That's
And just
what
as
I
if
mean
you
by
have
you
a
know
conversation with somebody, if you write thoughts, but you try and express your thoughts to somebody, it forces you to to shape and evaluate in your own mind before you express them. So I think that writing something down, and I mean, anyone who's written a diary or journal, however sort of non-academic and personal and emotional it might be, will know that by writing something down, there's an element of catharsis. It helps you to organise your thoughts. It helps you think how you're going to take the next step. So I think that expression is crucial. It's a different level to just thinking. But the thing that I really put my hand up for to do with whether boys write journals as much as girls, I was going to ask you what the percentage was with the FA.
I don't yet know. I've looked through the syllabuses for the coaching awards. It's actually coach educators and coaches. I've looked through the syllabuses, and it's very interesting. Reflection appears in little tick boxes, and it sort of says reflection and self-evaluation and things like that, but actually it's all in a matter of tick boxes, and I think, it might well just disappear in that. I don't, I can't, then it becomes a matter of whether actually somebody takes care to make sure people do reflect, or whether it's simply, oh yes, you said that you had some weaknesses in your last coaching activities, and good, you wouldn't be aware of that, so we'll tick that. So I don't know yet, and I'm not that far along the line with it yet, but certainly the FA have decided that they need coaches who are reflective, which is interesting.
Jenny, I just wanted to return to Emma's really thoughtful thought.
Yes.
Which is a completely different context, but a couple of years ago I tried out with some quite young children, 8 and 9-year-olds, who were very, very reluctant writers, using the notion of reflective journals. And what happened was this, that I gave them permission that these pieces of writing were not a performance, they were private. We talked through lots of ways in which they would be structured, and it's something that we all did. But actually part of the performance of this reflection was that actually they could choose the way in which they then bound them up and kept them.
I think that's really important.
And
yes.
what was fascinating was, to begin with, they didn't believe me that they didn't have to share. But what it was, the permission given that actually writing was something for you, and that they could do that. So I think there's so much about, we may be told that it's reflective and that we're not directly assessing it, but actually as soon as it's made public, it changes.
I mean, I've actually got when I define reflection, I also have an academic sort of added bit, which is about, well, actually the reflection done in higher education is usually seen by somebody else, and that will modify what it's actually done. So, and I so agree with you about that sense of ownership. This is mine, this is my personal stuff. And actually, I didn't say very much of what but you will have seen from the way I think about how the formats of my journals, how much it is a sort of personal thing for me. It's important, for example, for me that I've got a nice picture on the front, and I keep pictures that I might use on the front of journals, and that's important for me. And my leather case for my travel journal is important. So I think that I make them personal. That's one of the things that's really nice about it. But as we said, the difficulty is in higher education, the chances are somebody's going to have a look at what's done. I should have told you a little story about that. Sorry, I will come back to you. Yes, it was a friend of mine did her PhD, and it was about 1990, so it was quite early on teacher education students and journals that they wrote. So it was quite early on in the days of writing journals. And she asked the students what they thought the tutor might want to see in the journals. And they said, plenty of self-flagellation. So you can guess what the tutor got in the journals that he saw. But I had to think about that, because people might then say, rightly, well, why bother about journals? If tutors are simply going to see what students think they want to see, you know, what's the point of them? Well, I actually had to think about that. Well, okay, so a student is out in a school and something goes wrong, or right even actually, but something goes wrong in this case, in her teaching practice, and she needs to write about it, but she thinks, oh, I don't really want to admit fully all the mistakes I made there. So she does the thinking about it, then she writes down a version, which is what then goes to the tutor. So you think about that little sequence. Actually, the reflection was done on the event. It may be that the tutor didn't see a version of it that was exactly, you know, what was originally the original reflection, but at least the fact that the tutor wanted to see something meant that that sequence was actually gone through. So I think by asking students to write journals, we do encourage reflection, even if what we actually see, you know, let's face it, matches the criteria that we might use for any kind of marking. That's just the way it is. But that reflection is done.
My question really is about kind of the opposite of that question, which is reflection that becomes assessment. It's assessed.
Right.
And so I work with two programs, high school and middle school, I suppose, students, where it's in theatre.
Yes.
And the journal is absolutely key to the assessment, because it's not assessing, the ethos isn't that we assess process and reflection rather than outcome. The question I have really is, one of the challenges we face is how you give someone else access to your reflection if you're not writing in a continuous writing format in prose.
Yeah.
So we have lots of students who write with little pictures and storyboards and
Great,
mind
yes.
maps, which are fantastic.
I love it, yes.
The question then is that against the criteria, which is about reflection, it's sometimes difficult to know what's going on because we don't have the key to those mind processes. So what's your recommendation on that?
Well, a bit of self-assessment, I guess, is one possibility. But in the end, I suppose my immediate instinct is to get some sort of summarising done in some sort of account of what I have learned as a result of doing the journal. Because, of course, when you get that to be done, you've got something that looks much more like the sort of things we normally mark in written prose. But again, you might not be wanting to get anything that's so based on written text.
It's the struggle between authentic reflection and the outside eye, I suppose.
Yes. Anyone else had experiences like that who would like to add anything to that?
Well, I think it's just coming back to the idea of commentary, which is certainly what I use. But I mean, I don't think anybody here goes back far enough. We used to on the PGCE here, which I haven't been involved with for years, but when I was going back to sort of mid-90s, that was the way that the thing was assessed. Was basically, it was called the file, and people used to hand in something like this, which was like an account of their year. But of course, you couldn't expect somebody to go through all of this. So what you had was a sort of a guide to it. So people would produce a guide which would enable you to assess the thing.
Yes. I mean, there are issues around this that makes mean you need to go back and think, why am I doing this? What is it I need to see students getting out of it? And be really, really clear about purpose, and then that starts perhaps to give you a key to how you can get inside the assessment of it. Just Karen.
Yeah, no, just tying in with your idea. In a previous institution, I've worked with the idea of patchwork texts and the idea of producing different articles, whether it be writing or physical, or and again with trainees, teacher trainees, they often produced artefacts for their classroom, things that the kids could use or could explain something, and they produced 5 or 6 of these, but the piece of writing was what we marked
Yes.
because we had to conform. And it's, you know, you can do these radical different types of assessment, but eventually people like to see something that they recognise, unfortunately, in a way, and something that's then judgeable against each other as well. Because otherwise it just becomes the biggest, best model that people put hours and hours into rather than something that isn't. But the writing is what can be judged. And I suppose it's the same here on the PGC with my students. I try to encourage they can do it in any way they want, whether it be videos or stories or poems, but they have to know that 5 times a year they have to hand in a piece of prose that summarises that. But I think it's that second reflection that you talked about, so that, you know, their storyboards and their poems and things are their first reflection, and they're all
reflections, yes.
They're all ideas, but it's the going back. And I was one of John's students on the Masters, which is what started me on this journey completely on my own for myself, and I think that, so I've always been encouraged to do that reflection and that commentary at second hand, if not third or fourth, to keep going back at different periods of time.
I'm seeing lots of hands. I'm aware that we've got half an hour, and I really want to introduce you some structured reflection. You had your hand up before I said that. Do you mind if we move on? I'll listen to the question.
I was saying look at the criteria, can't they? You know, and the criteria, they're not fixed, are they? I mean, you can adjust the criteria by which you're assessing the journals.
Actually, yes.
The other thing, which is going to be the goalposts. And the other thing is, okay, you might be looking for critical writing, but does that have to be one slab of text, or could it be annotated? So you've got the storyboards and all the rest of it. You could get the kids to have annotated boxes which talk about what bits are, so it's located rather than this single slab.
But actually what you're reminding me of is that actually it is possible to get students to think of their own assessment criteria. Okay, you've produced all this. How am I meant to mark it? Against what criteria do I now mark this? Or get them to think of it beforehand, but I actually think it was quite an interesting thought to actually get them to give you the assessment criteria at the end, and or to do it themselves. So there are lots of different things.
Oh, sorry.
Well, I did say no more questions.
We had, on the maths course, we had to do this really open problem at the end of our course, and everyone did it completely different, and I made little models out of paper, and someone else just had traditionally, like with their maths formula on a piece of paper. But once we'd all completed it, as a class we had to come up with the assessment criteria, and then when we swapped them over, it actually didn't matter that like someone's was black and white and someone else's was colour, because we weren't really looking at presentation. It was more like, had you been logical, like where you were working out clear or something. So that actually worked quite well, and the fact that we didn't know the criteria before we were doing the task was also really important, because if we'd known the criteria, we would have tailored the task to the criteria. So doing it the other way around made it that everyone's working was completely open, which was quite useful.
I suppose it's like, justify the existence of this piece of work, you know, what are the criteria which allow you to do that? Okay, I have decided I am going to do 3 exercises in this short period of time, because it'll show you some ways of working with journals and with ideas. But we won't have long on any of them, and we will whisk through them very, very quickly. The first thing I'm going to get you to do is to think about a kind of research problem, or a problem in your teaching practice if you're a student, or an issue that you want to think about that's personal. Nobody's going to ask you, by the way, to say what these things are. So just think of an issue that you want to do a bit of thinking about. Very quickly, and write about 2 or 3 lines about it on a scrap of paper in front of you. Have you all got something to write on? Right. Now, the first part of this is to take a chunk of paper, and if you want to take... Oh, we've got some of this as well. You can take a piece of this paper or a bigger piece and do a sort of bit of a concept map around the issue, just to explore it and look at the ramifications of it. So I think I didn't see these, so if people are happy with the slightly smaller pieces, I'll put them on the table. Just play around with the idea, and you've got about 6 or 7 minutes to do it, so not very long. Normally I would expect it to be longer. Now, actually, I realise that wasn't entirely fair, because the next bit, it does mean a bit going public, but nobody will need to go public unless they want to. This bit, I think, is really interesting, this bit of the exercise. I'd like you to work in probably about threes. And you're not all going to have a turn at this just now, but you know, if you can manipulate situations so you have a turn at another stage, perhaps. What I want you to do is that one of you, and I think we will only have time for one of you, just talk a little bit about the issue that you're working on. So if you don't want to make it public, don't be the person who does that. Tell the other people what it is. Actually, I'll say groups of three, maybe we'll have groups of 5 or thereabouts, so you might need to shift around a little bit. And then I want the other people, well, including yourself actually, to throw in absurd solutions to that. Okay? This is it's a loosening activity, and it really seems sometimes an absurd solution to a problem, actually you suddenly think, wow, yes, there's something in that. And it's really worth doing. It's amazing how interesting ideas come up that way. So can you very quickly kind of shift around so you're in groups of say 4 or 5, and one of you perhaps just offer to do this. Again, it's like a demonstration rather than, you know, you all having a chance. And be as absurd as you can, please.
I'm always pursuing these things. It's constantly behind this strategy that feeds into my learning research success. Because I'm always finding out how to teach training.
And on the Tuesday evening, I have to do things like what I've identified, which is amazing. I'm not going to my group, certainly to everybody was repeated it.
Get them to fill their own paperwork.
Because it was the most absurd, I guess it's a pure escape, it's seen as like pure escape.
Get them to actually cook inside. Yeah, that's a good idea.
This is people. And then see whether you was really right
Because then you can take the time that you spend wondering about what to do to write yourself. We better.
And I think
Okay, I'm sorry about this. I've got about 12 minutes to do the third activity, and actually for me, this third part is really, really important. What I would like to suggest, you know, on the assumption that in a bigger time you would all have a chance to have a go at absurd solutions to your issues, I would then say actually spend 10 minutes, 5 minutes just writing up ideas. So that would be the next stage, and I'm going to miss that out completely. The last bit I'm going to do is, again, is actually lifted, well, the idea is lifted from Ira Progoff's work. He calls this stepping stones. I call it, oh no, I call it stepping stones. He calls it something else. I can't remember what it is. Anyway. Okay. Now, the next bit involves having a dialogue. Okay. Now, there may be people in your issue with whom you might want to have a dialogue on paper. Okay? I'm not talking about anything in reality. So a dialogue would be something like you'd write your name and you'd say, so-and-so, you know, I've got an issue about this, or, you know, whatever it is. And then you just don't force it, but just sort of get a sense of what that other person might say and write it down. The other person will never know you've done this. Okay? And then you might want to come back and respond to that. So that's one form of dialogue. It's like a little play script, I guess, between you and perhaps one person in your issue. However, it doesn't need to be somebody you know. It could be somebody. It could be a theorist about whose work, you know, you're doing some research. So you have a conversation with somebody you don't know, but still do it like I've suggested. So you put down what the issue is for you. And then you put down the other person's name and the response, and then you have a conversation on paper. But it might not be somebody it might be a mentor, somebody who's been really helpful to you in the past, but who isn't around now. So you could call in your kind of sense of their expertise to focus on to your current issue. It might be a school teacher at school who meant a lot to you, or, you know, anybody. But it might be a mentor, I mean, it might be a figure that a religious figure, or somebody whose work you admire. Now, it doesn't have to be a person at all. If you are an artist, you are trying to construct a painting, and you can't somehow get something right, so you might have a conversation with the painting. Painting, I can't seem what I've got, what is in you is too green, and I can't see where I need to change it. And you listen to the painting and what the painting has to say to you. Or it might be a thesis that you are meant to be writing up. Thesis. I can't seem to get started on you. What's going on? Okay? It could be a political party, a prime minister, a queen, whatever you like. So you have a dialogue on paper with something or somebody that is central to your issue. It may well be, and it often does actually turn out to be, that you start doing this and you think, actually this is not, I now realise I'm having the dialogue with the wrong element, the wrong person, or the wrong thing. So change it. Do it with something else or somebody else. I've run this workshop with research students who are doing PhDs, and I remember vividly somebody, one of the researchers saying she was doing research on George Eliot, the writer, and she'd had a dialogue with George Eliot, and she was so excited because actually it had given her a new way of thinking about her research. I don't know exactly what it was. I did this work in Australia fairly recently, and I couldn't understand why there was a guy who seemed to be quite animated, but then he sat back when I was doing this exercise. He wrote a little bit, and then he sat right back and just put his head behind it. And he said he'd sorted out, you know, through it and through actually the absurd stuff as well. Some research things that he'd been struggling on had just suddenly come to place. So these kinds of exercises are great just for sometimes for cracking problems. But I mean, I would use the dialogues exercise for issues in my personal life if I've got a problem to solve. I find it really helpful, and it's amazing how often somehow you get into an area of thinking that you wouldn't have got into if you just sat down and done it. Now, I'm going to invite you to have a go at that with reference to your current issue or something else. Now, for what have we got? 5 minutes. Just start doing it. It's not until you start doing these things that sometimes you see the value of them, so have a go. From doing these exercises that we want to say, share.
I think it's really interesting how, in fact, these exercises very much come back to the issues that you're raising, Emily, because these are things about us. our battles, our internal battles with ourselves in terms of our reflexivity. And they're quite hard to do because it means you have to really engage emotionally, cognitively, etc. But they don't feel dangerous in the same way as writing something that you know is automatically for an external.
Yeah.
So they're quite different things. So I this feels very safe.
I found myself venting because I've got a problem, and right now I feel quite good because I think I know how to deal with it from writing this. But I wouldn't want someone to read it.
No, but this is a tool, I think, I would say, not necessarily for an overt bit of a journal, but it's a sort of journal tool for the bits of the pages you take out. Okay, well, thank you. I just thought I'd mention, one or two sort of thoughts about that particular exercise. I guess if I'm a teacher working with a whole class of children and one or two of them I have problems with, actually having this kind of dialogue on paper is a good way of exploring and trying to get inside the head of somebody else. So just have that's a fairly practical application of it. One of the ways in which I used it, which is again a sort of extension of it, is that I did an MA fairly recently in creative writing, and I wrote a play as my last, as my final piece. And actually I had dialogues with all my characters, and it was amazing how much they told me about themselves. And it can be used quite a lot in theatre stuff and acting, because I've read about students people being asked to write journals as if they are a character within a play, for example, within something in the literary. So there's lots of creative things you can do around these exercises. Not so much, which isn't necessarily exactly how I've suggested you use them. Yes, play with them. Okay, so there's some ways of playing with the idea of journals, as well as just getting people to write straightforward journals. I think the best journals have some structured stuff in like this, which might be questions they need to answer and things like that, as well as these kind of exercises, as well as space just for straightforward reflection. Right, okay, that's it, I think.
Consolidate the thoughts I've got from reading your writing, and then the last exercise made me smile as you were setting it, because Rebecca and I met while doing our masters, and one of the courses we did was on creative writing, and we had to write a dialogue, and I wrote to you, and we had quite a long conversation about the prospect of you coming and talking to us, and how come if you were in Bournemouth I hadn't bumped into you and all this sort of stuff, not knowing you lived in Exeter, and that's why I hadn't bumped into you, obviously. But there's lots of things that you've said that I've just sat here nodding. The idea of keeping journals that are pretty and important to you. I have a whole selection of lovely books that I can almost stroke, that I won't write in because they're too pretty to write journals in with my horrible handwriting. I don't know if you go through that whole process. I have to get the right book, I have to get the right pen, and then I can get going, but it takes a long while to put that word on a page and dirty a book with my thoughts sometimes. And I do a lot of venting, as my colleague here was saying earlier, when I'm writing in my books. But it's great. You've allowed us to consider, I think, a broad range of ideas that have come across the room from yours, and definitely the problematic ideas of writing, and that's how this journey started for me when John set us the idea of writing a reflective journal, and that was it. So again, what's that then? Because as a trainee teacher, I'd had to write one, and all I'd been told was I'd kept a diary, and that was all the help I got. And every time I use your levels of reflective writing with my trainees, I get lots of, that's what people have meant over these years. So I found it really useful, and I know my trainees have. So thank you, and thank you for pushing us to experiment with these ideas right at the end there.
Well, it's easy for me, I just found it.
So, yeah, I'd like to think there were a few solutions found, and a few arguments had, and maybe people will go on to sort out these problems in their things they've been thinking about. But thank you once again.
You're welcome.